They chose the quiet sister for the Duke as a joke, but her quiet gaze would teach him what his cold heart had forgotten. Yorkshire, 1856. Snow fell across the moorlands like a shroud over all the words that had never been spoken. Lady Leticia Fairweather stood at the tall window of the morning room, her fingers tracing the frost patterns that had bloomed overnight across the glass, delicate as lace and just as fragile. Beyond, December light lay thin and pale across the frozen earth, making the world appear both impossibly sharp and impossibly distant, as though everything had retreated into itself for winter. She had always taken comfort in such light, the kind that neither demanded attention nor offered warmth. That comfort was about to be shattered like ice beneath a careless boot. "Miss Leticia, your mother requires you in the green drawing-room," Mrs. Dorothea Pemberton had said not an hour past. Though the housekeeper's voice remained neutral, her eyes held something else this morning, pity, perhaps, or warning, though Mrs. Pemberton was far too professional to let such things linger longer than a breath. Leticia had known then, the way one knows the taste of snow before it falls, that whatever awaited her below was not ordinary household business. If you're watching this alone right now, believing no one sees you, type your city in the comments. You're not invisible to me. I see every single one of you. The green drawing room at Blackthorn Hall smelled of applewood smoke and dried orange pomanders, scents that should have brought comfort but instead made the air feel suffocating. Her mother sat near the hearth, dressed in the unrelieved black of mourning she had worn for 23 years, as though widowhood were an identity Mrs. Honoria Fairweather had chosen rather than endured. Beside her, arranged with the precision of a chess player who already knows the outcome, sat Lady Philippa. Her sister. Philippa, who had married Mr. Percival Ridley, a Liverpool shipping merchant, and returned each Christmas to Blackthorn Hall as though conferring blessings upon lesser mortals. "Leticia, dearest," her mother began, and the tremor in her voice was not grief but something sharper, desperation barely held in check. "Your sister has brought the most extraordinary news from her acquaintances in the north." Leticia did not sit. She stood just inside the doorway, hands clasped before her, waiting. She had learned long ago that survival meant making herself as small and unremarkable as possible, a skill perfected over years of being compared to Philippa's beauty, Philippa's wit, Philippa's advantageous marriage. "The Duke of Winterbourne is in residence at his estate," Philippa said, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Winterbourne Manor lies not 12 miles from Lord Julian Ashcombe's property near Thirsk. His Grace has been quite withdrawn since his unfortunate circumstances. There are those who believe he will never take a wife, that he has chosen solitude over society." "I fail to understand why you are telling me this," Leticia said quietly. Her mother made a small sound, caught between a cough and something that might have been a sob had she allowed it to fully form. "You are to marry him," Philippa announced, delight no longer concealed. "The arrangement has been made. Lord Ashcombe, who manages several of his Grace's northern properties and is connected to us through mother's side, found the notion rather amusing when I suggested it. A match between the reclusive Duke and our dear Leticia, who is, after all, quite suited to a quiet life. He brought it to his Grace himself as something of a witticism, and the Duke, being indifferent to sentiment and requiring only an heir and a wife of unimpeachable respectability, accepted." The floor tilted beneath Leticia's feet. She reached for the nearest chair to steady herself. Alastair Montague Winterbourne, a name she had heard only in passing, attached to stories of wealth and isolation and a coldness that had grown legendary among the northern families. "A witticism," she repeated, her voice strange to her own ears. "You arranged my marriage as a jest." "A jest that comes with a very substantial settlement," Mrs. Honoria Fairweather interjected, her voice growing stronger, almost defiant. "Your sister has secured for us an arrangement that will ensure this family's comfort for decades, Leticia. His Grace requires only a wife of suitable breeding and discretion. You are both. This is an opportunity beyond anything you might have hoped for." Leticia looked at her sister, at the satisfaction that played across Philippa's face like light across water. She understood then what she had always suspected but never fully acknowledged. To her family, she was not a daughter or sister but a problem to be solved, a burden to be lifted, a piece to be moved across the board until it finally served some useful purpose. When? The word came out barely above a whisper. A fortnight, Philippa said. The marriage will be formalized by special license. Very discreet, very proper. A quiet ceremony at St. Ethelred's chapel with only the immediate household present. His Grace is quite adamant about avoiding any fuss. There would be no celebration. No announcement in the papers declaring the Fairweather girl's elevation to Duchess. No ball in her honor, no gathering of well-wishers. Only silence, and beneath that silence, the knowledge that she had been offered as entertainment, accepted as convenience, and was about to become the Duchess of Winterbourne because she was, fundamentally, the sister who did not matter. I should like to retire, Leticia said, surprised by how steady her voice had become. Of course, her mother replied. You'll want to begin selecting which of your things are suitable for your new position. Leticia climbed the narrow stairs to her small room on the third floor of Blackthorn Hall, where the cold always settled most heavily. Her chamber had never been fashionable, never been the room of a favored daughter, but it had been hers. The bed with its faded counterpane, the writing desk where she had spent years copying letters and keeping household accounts, the small bookshelf with its collection of well-worn volumes. Evidence of a life lived in the margins of other people's importance. She did not weep. Instead, she went to the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass, letting the chill seep into her skin until it almost hurt. Beyond, the moors stretched away toward a white infinity, and somewhere to the north across those frozen expanses stood Alastair Winterbourne, a man who did not know her name, had not chosen her, and would come to their marriage bed with the same indifference one might bring to any tedious obligation. She was to marry a stranger for a reason that was fundamentally a joke. The absurdity of it would have been almost amusing, were the stakes not her entire life. That evening, Mrs. Dorothea Pemberton brought a supper tray that Leticia could not touch. The older woman set it down on the small writing desk and stood for a moment, hands folded in that knowing way of servants who understand that silence sometimes speaks more eloquently than words. The single candle threw shadows across the housekeeper's lined face, and in those shadows Leticia saw something unexpected. Kinship, perhaps. Or recognition of an injustice that even a woman of Mrs. Pemberton's position could not remedy. Miss Leticia, the housekeeper said at last, her voice low enough that it would not carry beyond the door. Your Grace, I should say, though the title feels strange when you are still here in this room that has been yours since childhood. I am not her Grace yet, Leticia replied. And perhaps I never shall be in any way that matters. Mrs. Pemberton moved closer, and the candlelight caught the steel in her grey eyes. His Grace will require a wife of considerable character, she said. Not flashiness, Miss Leticia. Not beauty that announces itself or wit that demands attention. Character. The quiet sort that does not declare itself in drawing rooms but proves itself in small moments, in steady presence, in the courage to remain dignified when dignity is all one has left. Leticia looked up at the woman who had been more mother to her than Mrs. Honoria Fairweather had ever chosen to be. You speak as though dignity might be enough. I speak as though dignity might be everything, Mrs. Pemberton corrected gently. His Grace has known women of great beauty and greater cruelty. What he has not known, I suspect, is a woman who understands what it means to be overlooked and who has not allowed that overlooking to make her bitter or small. She paused at the door. If you were to remember that, Miss Leticia, you might find that what appears to be a jest is in fact an opportunity of a very different kind. When the housekeeper had gone, Leticia returned to her window. Stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, each one small and distant and inexplicably bright against the vast indifference of the winter night. She had never asked to be chosen. She had certainly never imagined being chosen for mockery. And yet there was some small stubborn seed of defiance that stirred in her chest like the first promise of spring beneath frozen ground. If she was to be the Duchess of Winterbourne, even a duchess born of jest and married to a man who felt nothing for her, then she would be one with an integrity that no amount of cruelty could diminish. She would enter Winterbourne Manor not as a victim accepting her fate but as a woman who understood her own worth even if no one else did. The next morning brought confirmation she had both hoped for and dreaded. Mr. Benedict Hawthorne, the Duke's head steward, arrived at Blackthorn Hall with a letter bearing the Winterbourne seal. The Duke had accepted the arrangement. The letter stated in handwriting that was precise and utterly without warmth, and would expect his bride to arrive at Winterbourne Manor 3 days hence. The ceremony would take place the following morning in St. Ethelred's Chapel. No further correspondence would be necessary. Leticia read the letter twice, searching for some hint of the man behind the words. She found nothing. It was a document that might have been written about the acquisition of property or the settlement of an estate matter. She was, in his mind, a transaction to be completed with efficiency and minimal disruption to his ordered life. Well, Philippa said, reading over her shoulder with undisguised delight. It seems His Grace is every bit as indifferent as Lord Ashcombe promised. How perfectly matched you are, dear sister. The invisible girl and the man who cannot be bothered to see anyone at all. Mrs. Honoria Fairweather said nothing, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured her morning tea, and Leticia understood that her mother's guilt, such as it was, would never be sufficient to alter what had been set in motion. That night, Leticia lay awake listening to the wind move across the moors, and she made herself a promise. She would not beg for love or validation from Alistair Winterbourne. She would not perform or pretend or make herself smaller to accommodate his indifference. She would simply be herself, with all the quiet strength that had allowed her to survive this long in a family that had never wanted her, and she would see what a man who had forgotten how to feel might do when confronted with someone who refused to disappear. The Duke had accepted her as though she were no more significant than a new horse for his stable. Very well. She would arrive at Winterbourne Manor and show him that even a horse, if treated with cruelty long enough, might one day refuse to be ridden. The carriage journey to Winterbourne Manor took the better part of a day, and with every mile that passed, the landscape grew more unforgiving. The gentle hills around Blackthorn Hall gave way to harder country, where stone broke through the earth like bones through skin, and the few trees that survived the northern winds grew twisted and low. This was land that did not welcome softness, that had no patience for anything that could not endure. Mrs. Pemberton, who had insisted on accompanying Leticia despite Mrs. Honoria Fairweather's protests about unnecessary expense, sat across from her in the carriage and watched the passing scenery with knowing eyes. When Winterbourne Manor finally came into view, rising from the winter landscape like a declaration carved in stone, the housekeeper reached across and took Leticia's hand. "There will be staff watching when we arrive," she said. "All of them will form their judgments in the first moments. Hold your head high, Miss Leticia. You are Her Grace now, whether the Duke acknowledges it or not. Dignify yourself, and they will have no choice but to respect you." The manor itself was more imposing than Leticia had imagined. It stood 4 stories high, built of grey Yorkshire stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, with mullioned windows that looked out across the frozen grounds like eyes that had seen too much and learned to expect nothing. No garlands decorated the entrance for the approaching bride. No wreaths hung upon the massive oak doors. It was a house that had grown accustomed to winter and had made its peace with coldness, or perhaps had surrendered to it entirely. The Duke did not meet them in the entrance hall. Instead, Mr. Benedict Hawthorne, a man whose stern face and precise movements suggested he had spent his life in service to discipline rather than warmth, showed Leticia to her chambers. They were not unpleasant, a suite of rooms decorated in muted greens and golds, with windows overlooking the frost-white grounds and a fireplace already burning with steady, impersonal efficiency. "His Grace will see you at supper this evening," Mr. Hawthorne said, his voice neutral as parchment. "The ceremony tomorrow will take place at 10 o'clock in St. Ethelred's Chapel. Mrs. Pemberton will be shown to the housekeeper's quarters and may attend you as needed." When he had gone, Leticia stood in the center of her new rooms and felt the full weight of her situation settle upon her shoulders like snow that had been accumulating all day and finally chose this moment to become unbearable. These chambers were separate from the family apartments. She was to be housed with formal courtesy and equally formal distance, a wife in name but not in any way that suggested actual partnership or intimacy. Mrs. Pemberton found her standing at the window some time later, staring out at the grounds where twilight was beginning to gather in the hollows between the bare trees. "I have spoken with Mrs. Morrison, the head housekeeper here," she said. "She tells me that His Grace maintains the winter conservatory himself." It was his mother's sanctuary, apparently. The Duchess Seraphina was devoted to growing things, and when she passed some years ago, the Duke could not bear to let it fall into neglect. Leticia turned from the window. "A man who tends growing things," she said slowly, "is not a man entirely without tenderness, is he?" "No, Miss Leticia," Mrs. Pemberton agreed. "He is not." That night, Leticia could not sleep. She sat at the writing desk in her chamber and began letters she would never send, letters to no one in particular that tried to make sense of what was happening to her. "I am to marry a man who does not want me," she wrote, "and I cannot tell whether I should be grateful for his indifference or terrified by it. At least indifference is honest. At least it does not pretend to be something it is not." Somewhere in this vast cold house, Alastair Winterbourne was also awake, also alone. She wondered if he was thinking of her at all, or if she was truly as insignificant to him as the letter had suggested. I know some of you watching right now are in a relationship where you feel invisible. Where you're standing right next to someone who doesn't see you. If that's you, or if it was you, drop a love in the comments. You're not alone in this. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. Mrs. Pemberton helped Leticia into a simple gown of white silk, nothing elaborate, nothing that suggested this was a day of celebration rather than obligation. The housekeeper had somehow procured a small posy of evergreen and winter jasmine, tied with white ribbon, and she pressed it into Leticia's hands with fierce tenderness. "You cannot marry without flowers," Mrs. Pemberton said firmly. "These are from the winter conservatory. His Grace maintains it, though few know that he does. Perhaps that tells you something worth remembering." St. Ethelred's Chapel stood at the far edge of the manor grounds, a stone building that had witnessed centuries of Winterbourne family ceremonies and carried the cold dignity of all those accumulated years. Inside, the air was bitter enough that each breath made small clouds, and the light that filtered through the narrow windows seemed reluctant to enter, as though even illumination hesitated to intrude upon what was about to take place. Alastair Winterbourne stood waiting near the altar with the composure of a man attending a business transaction rather than his own wedding. He was taller than Leticia had imagined, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples and eyes that were grey as winter storms. There was a hollowness around his eyes and a tightness at the corners of his mouth that spoke of a man who had spent considerable time looking at distance and finding nothing there to comfort him. He did not meet her eyes as she walked down the short aisle. He did not acknowledge her presence beyond the slightest inclination of his head that might have been courtesy or might simply have been an involuntary response to movement in his peripheral vision. Reverend Augustus Bell, an elderly clergyman who had clearly performed this ceremony many times before and had learned not to expect joy from every occasion, began the service with a voice that echoed in the cold space. The words were familiar, the ancient liturgy that had bound countless couples across the centuries, but here in this frozen chapel they sounded less like promises and more like sentencing. When the Reverend asked if Alastair Montague Winterbourne took Lady Leticia Fairweather as his wife, the Duke answered "I do" in a voice so quiet it might have been consent or condemnation. There was no way to distinguish between them. His hands, when he took hers to place the ring upon her finger, were warm. Leticia had not expected that. She had imagined everything about him would be cold, frozen through like the landscape outside. But his hands were warm, and they trembled slightly, though whether from the temperature of the chapel or from some deeper disturbance she could not determine. It was the first indication she had that he was, beneath the rigid control, actually human. The wedding breakfast was held in one of the smaller dining rooms, with perhaps 30 members of the household and immediate staff present. No one offered toasts. No one congratulated the couple with anything approaching genuine warmth. Instead, there was the peculiar politeness of people performing obligation, the pretense of celebration layered over profound discomfort. Mr. Benedict Hawthorne presided over the meal with grim efficiency, ensuring that plates were filled and glasses remained full while the bride and groom sat in silence at the head of the table. It was during this meal that Leticia first understood the full scope of her husband's isolation. He sat motionless, eating with mechanical precision, attending to necessary maintenance rather than pleasure. The staff, though well-trained and obedient, moved around him with visible caution. They spoke only when directly addressed, and even then in voices barely above a whisper. He had constructed around himself a fortress of solitude so complete that even those who served him daily knew better than to attempt genuine connection. After the meal he rose, and with a slight bow that was entirely formal, excused himself. He did not invite her to join him. He did not offer any acknowledgement of the commitment just undertaken. He simply left, and Leticia understood that whatever duties a husband owed a wife, they would not be exercised with any warmth of feeling. Mrs. Pemberton found her in the corridor some time later, standing at a window that overlooked the frozen gardens, her untouched posy of evergreen and jasmine still clutched in her hands. The housekeeper's face was troubled, but her voice when she spoke was steady. "His Grace lost his wife some years ago," she said quietly, though Leticia had not asked. "Not in death, though that would have been perhaps kinder. She left him." Lady Helena chose abandonment over remaining at his side. It was not spoken of in the household, but the staff knew. "They have seen what it did to him. Turned a man of gentle capacity into something locked away, like a watch wound too tight." Leticia found herself unexpectedly moved by this revelation. She had come expecting to marry a man of indifference. She had instead married a man of terrible conscious suffering, who had sealed himself away so thoroughly that even kindness might no longer penetrate his walls. "Then I am," she said slowly, "a remedy for his practical inconvenience. A woman to give his name legitimacy and his house the appearance of order. Nothing more." "You are whatever you choose to be," Mrs. Pemberton replied. "His Grace will not prevent you from being anything. He has walled himself away too thoroughly to care what you do with your freedom. The question is not what he will allow, but what you will make of the space he has given you." She paused. "And whether you might, in time, find a way through those walls." That evening, Leticia stood again at her window and watched darkness settle over Winterbourne Manor like a benediction or a curse, she could not yet tell which. Somewhere in this vast house, Alastair Winterbourne was also alone, also maintaining his distance from anything that might penetrate the armor he had built around his damaged heart. She had married a stranger for a reason that was fundamentally a jest. But perhaps, she thought as the first stars began to appear in the winter sky, perhaps the jest was not on her after all. Perhaps it was on the man who believed he could survive indefinitely in his self-imposed exile, who had not yet understood that even the coldest winter must eventually yield to spring. The days following the wedding took on a strange, suspended quality, as though time itself had slowed in the cold air of Winterbourne Manor. The Duke maintained a schedule of monastic precision. He rose early, attended to estate business in his private study, took his meals in solitary dignity, and withdrew each evening to quarters that were entirely separate from Leticia's own. They might have been strangers living in different houses for all the contact they had. Leticia, left largely to her own devices, began to learn the architecture of the manor. It was a house of unexpected corners and hidden spaces, of corridors that led to rooms unopened in years, of windows that overlooked gardens long since gone wild. There was something melancholy about it, this great house that had once surely been full of life and warmth but now felt like a mausoleum dedicated to the memory of better times. It was on the fourth afternoon of her marriage, while following the faint sound of a crackling fire somewhere in the upper floors, that she discovered his study. She had not meant to intrude. She had simply been walking the corridor, trying to understand the layout of this place that was supposedly now her home, when she noticed a door standing slightly ajar. The room beyond was neither grand nor theatrical. It was simply a space where a man worked and thought, and perhaps suffered in private. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their spines worn from use rather than arranged for display. A fire burned in the hearth, and the afternoon light slanted through the windows in that particular way winter light has, thin and silver and somehow both sharp and soft at once. And there, upon the writing desk, placed with obvious care in a spot where that light would touch it, sat a small crystal prism. Leticia stood in the doorway, not entering, simply observing. The light was hitting the prism in such a way that it threw delicate rainbows of refracted color across the leather surface of the desk blotter, across the scattered papers, across the stone walls. For a moment, this stark room was illuminated with unexpected beauty, with color born not from decoration but from clarity itself. "It belonged to my mother," a voice said quietly behind her. Leticia turned, her heart suddenly racing, to find Alistair Winterbourne standing there. She had not heard him approach, and the surprise of his presence so close made her breath catch. This was the nearest she had been to him since the chapel, near enough to see that his grey eyes held depths of exhaustion she had not noticed before, near enough to see the fine lines at the corners of his mouth that spoke of years of holding expression in check. "I apologize," she said immediately. "I did not mean to intrude." "You may enter," he said, and though it was not an invitation offered with warmth, neither was it a refusal. "I have no cause to forbid you. You are the Duchess of Winterbourne now, even if neither of us chose it." She stepped into the room warily, as though the floor might give way beneath her feet. She could feel his presence behind her, could sense the way he held himself with that same rigid control she had observed at their wedding. "The Duchess Seraphina gave it to me when I was a child," he continued, moving to stand before the window, his back to her in a way that suggested this was easier for him than facing her directly. "She told me that light was the same everywhere, but that one must choose the prism through which to see it. That one man's darkness might be another man's spectrum, depending entirely on what he placed between himself and the source of illumination." I did not understand her then. I believe I understand her rather better now. Leticia looked at the prism again, at the way it transformed ordinary sunlight into something miraculous. In the Duke's hands, it became more than decoration. It became metaphor, a symbol of the way one's perception of a thing determined its meaning entirely. "It is beautiful," she said quietly. "It is," he agreed, and there was something in his voice, a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "My former wife, Lady Helena, called it Mlin. A waste of desk space that might better accommodate documents of actual importance. She preferred things that announced themselves loudly, that demanded attention through size or cost or obvious display." There was no accusation in his tone, but there was profound sadness, managed as though he had learned to carry it the way one carries a weight that cannot ever be set down. "I believe," Leticia said, choosing her words with extreme care, "that there is a difference between things that are loud and things that are true. Your mother's prism is true. It teaches something real about light and perception. That is perhaps more valuable than volume could ever be." For the first time since she had known him, Alistair turned to look directly at her. His eyes were very grey in the afternoon light, the color of winter storms that had spent their fury and left only cold clarity behind. There was something in his gaze, a moment of surprising vulnerability before he shuttered it again. "You surprise me," he said quietly. "I had anticipated only compliance. Quiet acceptance of a situation neither of us wanted but both of us must now endure." "I hope I shall not disappoint you," Leticia replied, in offering somewhat more than mere acceptance. He inclined his head slightly, and then, as though the moment of connection had proven too great a strain upon his reserves, he withdrew again into the distant courtesy that had characterized all their interactions since the wedding. But something had shifted. Some small door that he had thought sealed permanently had proven to have a crack in its foundation, and through that crack a light had entered that he could not entirely block out again. "You may use the library whenever you wish," he said, his voice once again formal. "The house is yours now as much as it is mine. I have no desire to restrict your movements or your activities." "Thank you, Your Grace," Leticia said, and she meant it sincerely, though she suspected he would not believe that anything could be meant sincerely within the confines of their arrangement. When he had gone, she remained in the study for a few moments longer, looking at the prism and the rainbows it cast across surfaces that had known only shadow for too long. She thought about what Mrs. Pemberton had said about character proving itself in small moments, and she wondered if this had been one of them. If perhaps in speaking honestly about truth and loudness, about the value of things that did not demand attention, she had given him something he had not expected to receive. The prism sat in its place on the desk, catching light and transforming it into beauty, and Leticia found herself thinking that if she were very patient, very willing to exist in the same space as this wounded man without demanding anything from him, she might one day understand what had happened to make him believe that feeling itself was dangerous. For now, it was enough that he had spoken to her. That he had shared, however briefly, something that mattered to him. That he had looked at her directly and seemed to actually see her, if only for a moment. It was, she thought as she made her way back to her chambers, a beginning. Small and fragile as winter jasmine, but a beginning nonetheless. Over the following weeks, Leticia began to understand the patterns of Winterbourne Manor the way one learns the rhythms of a piece of music heard frequently enough to anticipate its movements. The Duke rose at dawn and spent his mornings in the study. He rode the estate grounds in the early afternoon unless the weather made it impossible. He dined alone in the small private dining room at precisely 7 o'clock each evening. And he retired to his chambers by 10, moving through his days with the precision of a man who had found safety in routine and dared not deviate from it. But small things were changing, though so subtly that Leticia might have missed them if she had not been paying such close attention. The crystal prism, which had sat in the same position for who knew how long, was moved slightly one morning, adjusted so that it caught a different angle of light. Books that had been gathering dust on high shelves began appearing on the study table, their subjects ranging from agricultural reform to poetry, as though someone were trying to decide what might interest a new presence in the house. Most tellingly, fires began appearing in rooms that had previously remained cold and unused. The library, which Mrs. Morrison the housekeeper said had not been opened in 3 years, suddenly had its hearth laid each morning. The small music room where Leticia had discovered a pianoforte in surprisingly good condition was warmed and dusted. And once, entering the morning room where she had taken to sitting with her needlework in the afternoons, she found that someone had placed a chair near the window at precisely the angle where the light would be best for close work. It was on a grey afternoon in early December that everything changed. Leticia had been sitting in the library, reading, when a housemaid entered with fresh coals for the fire. The girl, young, perhaps 16, did not see Leticia in the corner chair and began speaking to another maid in the corridor just beyond the open door. "Mrs. Morrison says her Grace is still here," then, the first maid said, her voice carrying that particular tone of gossip shared between equals. "I thought she'd have left by now, same as the first Duchess." "Don't be daft, Mary," the second maid replied. "Where would she go? Back to the family that sold her off as a joke? I heard Lord Ashcombe laughing about it with Mr. Hawthorne. Said it was the finest jest he'd seen in years, matching the invisible sister with the frozen Duke." "Still," Mary said, "it's cruel, innit? She seems a kind lady, even if she is quiet as a mouse. And his Grace barely looks at her. I seen them pass in the corridor yesterday and he didn't so much as nod. That's his way, though. Been like that since Lady Helena ran off with that colonel from London. Broke something in him, it did. Mrs. Morrison says he's been dead inside ever since, just going through the motions." Their voices faded as they moved down the corridor, leaving Leticia sitting frozen in her chair, the book forgotten in her lap. The words echoed in her mind like stones dropped into still water, spreading ripples that disturbed everything. Sold her off as a joke. The finest jest he'd seen in years. Dead inside. She stood abruptly, the book tumbling to the floor with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came short and sharp, as though the air itself had grown too thin to sustain her. All these weeks of maintaining her dignity, of telling herself that she could survive his indifference, that she could build something meaningful from the wreckage of this arrangement and the entire household knew. They knew she was a jest. They pitied her. Leticia fled the library, moving through the corridors without direction, driven only by the need to be somewhere, anywhere, that did not contain witnesses to her humiliation. She found herself eventually in the conservatory, that warm sanctuary where growing things thrived despite the frozen world outside. She sank onto a bench near the climbing jasmine and finally allowed the tears she had been holding back for weeks to fall. Great wrenching sobs that shook her entire body, grief and rage and humiliation all tangled together until she could not separate one from the other. She had thought she could endure this. She had thought dignity would be enough. But dignity could not protect her from the knowledge that she was laughed at, that even the servants saw her as an object of pity. Leticia. She looked up, startled, to find Alistair standing in the doorway of the conservatory. His expression was stricken in a way she had never seen before, as though her tears had cracked something in him that he had thought safely sealed away. "I did not mean," she began, but he crossed the space between them in 3 long strides and knelt before her, his hands hovering near her face as though he wanted to touch her but did not know if he had the right. "I heard the maids," he said, his voice rough with emotion she had not known he was capable of feeling. "I was in the study and I heard them speaking in the corridor about what Lord Ashcombe said." He drew a shaky breath. "Leticia, I am so profoundly sorry. I have been so focused on protecting myself from feeling anything that I did not consider what my coldness might cost you. What it might make others believe about your worth. They pity me," she whispered. "Your own household pities me." "They should not," he said fiercely. "And they will not, after tonight. I swear to you, Leticia, this ends now. No more distance. No more pretending that we are merely 2 people existing in the same house by accident of circumstance." He reached up, finally, and gently wiped the tears from her face with his thumbs. "You deserve so much better than what I have given you. Better than this cold house and this broken man who has been too much a coward to acknowledge what has been happening between us." "What has been happening between us?" she asked, hardly daring to hope. "I have been falling in love with you," he said simply. "Slowly, against my will, against every wall I built to prevent exactly this from happening. From the moment you spoke about the prism, about truth versus loudness, you have been dismantling my defenses piece by piece. And I have been letting you, even as I pretended to myself that I was still in control, that I was still safely distant. For those of you still watching, and I hope you are, because this is where everything changes if you've ever had to teach someone to see your worth, comment 'I see you' below. Let's create a thread of people who refuse to stay invisible." By Christmas, the household had begun to notice the change. The Duke no longer left immediately after the evening meal. Instead, he would retire to the main drawing room, where Leticia often sat with her needlework or a book, and would occupy himself with estate papers at a desk near hers. They did not always speak, but when they did, the conversations ranged from estate matters to philosophy to the books they were reading, and the servants who witnessed these exchanges began to understand that something fundamental had shifted in the marriage they had all assumed was merely convenient. The silence between them had transformed entirely. It was no longer the silence of 2 people avoiding each other, but rather the companionable quiet of 2 people who had learned they could exist together without performance or pretense. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snowfall and a quality of light that seemed to soften even Winterbourne Manor's severe lines. Leticia woke to find that the household staff had quietly decorated the main spaces with evergreen boughs and white ribbons, creating an atmosphere of restrained celebration. She had just finished her breakfast when she noticed a housemaid carrying fresh-cut evergreen through the corridor, moving with purpose toward the east wing. Curious, and with nothing particular to occupy her morning, Leticia followed at a discreet distance. The corridor led to a heavy oak door that stood partially open, and beyond it Leticia could hear sounds she had not expected. The trickle of water. The rustle of leaves. And beneath it all, a warmth that seemed impossible in the middle of a Yorkshire winter. She pushed the door open wider and stepped into another world entirely. The winter conservatory was exquisitely maintained. Glass panels formed the ceiling and much of the walls, creating a space where winter light poured in but winter cold was held at bay. Row upon row of plants thrived in this climate. Camellias on the point of blooming. Ferns unfurling toward the light with vivid green that spoke of health and tending. And in the corner, a climbing jasmine that had wound itself around the iron framework, filling the air with sweetness that stood in direct opposition to everything the frozen landscape outside represented. And there, among the growing things, knelt Alistair Winterbourne, his coat removed and his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, tending to one of the camellia plants with a gentleness that made everything Mrs. Pemberton had said about his capacity for nurturing suddenly, viscerally real. "I had no idea this existed," Leticia said softly. He did not turn immediately, but finished whatever task he was performing with the plant before straightening. When he finally faced her, there was something different in his expression. Not the blank mask he usually maintained, but something closer to resignation, as though he had known this moment would come eventually and had decided there was no point in continuing to hide this part of himself. "My mother loved growing things," he said, and his voice carried a weight of memory that made clear this place was sacred to him. This was her sanctuary when the responsibilities of being Duchess became too heavy, when society demanded too much and she needed somewhere that demanded nothing beyond attention and care. After she passed, I could not bear to let it fall into ruin. It seemed important to preserve what she had created, to tend what she had loved. "It is a kind act," Leticia said, moving deeper into the conservatory, "to care for what has been left behind." Alistair watched her approach, trying to determine whether her presence here was intrusion or something else. Something like understanding. "I had not thought of it as kindness," he said slowly. "I thought of it as obligation. Perhaps even penance for not appreciating her sufficiently while she lived." "Obligation and kindness are not always separate things," Leticia replied. She reached out to touch one of the camellia blooms, her movements mirroring the same care he had shown moments before. "This flower is blooming even though outside everything is frozen." "That is not merely obligation, Your Grace. That is hope. The belief that spring exists even when every visible thing argues against its possibility." "You speak as though you believe hope is a rational thing," Alistair said, and there was something almost bitter in his tone. "I have found it to be more often a form of exquisite torture. The promise of warmth that never quite arrives, the suggestion of light that remains perpetually just out of reach." Leticia turned to face him fully. "Perhaps," she acknowledged. "But is that not the very definition of something worth believing in? That it demands something of us? That it requires us to maintain our care and attention even when there is no immediate evidence that our efforts will be rewarded?" Around them, the conservatory pulsed with quiet life. The jasmine released another wave of sweetness into the warm air. Water dripped somewhere with steady patience. And between them, standing among his mother's preserved garden, something fundamental shifted in the way Alistair Winterbourne looked at the woman who had been thrust upon him as a jest and who had somehow, without his permission or even his awareness, begun to matter. He reached out, and with care that matched her own, adjusted one of the camellia blooms, turning it slightly so that it caught more of the pale winter light filtering through the glass above them. His hands, she noticed again, were not cold. They were warm with the warmth of someone who worked with living things, who understood that growth required not just attention but a kind of tenderness that could not be faked. "You are not what I expected," he said quietly, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "Neither of us," Leticia replied, "were expected in the way that circumstances would have preferred. Your family expected you to remain frozen in your grief. Mine expected me to remain invisible in my insignificance. Perhaps we are both more than what we were told we must be." For a long moment they stood there among the growing things, and Leticia had the sense that they were on the edge of something. Not love, perhaps not yet, but recognition. The acknowledgement that beneath the walls and practiced distance, beneath the jest that had brought them together and the pain that had shaped them both, there existed two people who were capable of seeing each other clearly. "The household will be preparing for the Christmas gathering this evening," Alistair said finally. "There will be guests." My cousin Lord Ashcombe and his party, some of the neighboring families. It is tradition. Leticia's heart grew suddenly heavy at the mention of Lord Ashcombe's name. The man who had helped facilitate her marriage as entertainment. I would ask, Alistair continued, and now he looked directly at her with an intensity that made her breath catch, that you stay close to me this evening. That you allow me to demonstrate that while our marriage began as something neither of us chose, it need not continue in that same spirit of indifference. It was, Leticia understood, as close to a declaration as he was currently capable of making. I would be honored, Your Grace, she said quietly. He inclined his head, and then, because the moment had become too intense for either of them to sustain, he returned his attention to the camellias, and Leticia understood she was being given permission to stay or leave as she chose. She chose to stay, moving quietly among the plants, asking questions about their care and receiving answers that grew gradually less guarded as the morning progressed. The evening began with all the formal precision that Winterbourne Manor had perfected over generations. Guests arrived in carriages that crunched across fresh snow, their faces ruddy with cold and bright with the particular excitement that Christmas gatherings inspired. The main drawing room had been transformed with evergreen garlands and white candles, creating an atmosphere that was elegant without being warm. Leticia stood beside her husband as they received their guests, and she noticed immediately how Alistair's demeanor had shifted. The distance he maintained in private had been replaced by something even more remote, an Arctic politeness that kept everyone at arm's length while fulfilling every social obligation with mechanical precision. The guests were the usual assemblage of local gentry and distant family connections, people who had known the Winterbournes for generations and who carried themselves with the confidence of those who believe their social position grants them the right to observe and judge freely. Leticia felt their gazes upon her, assessing her dress, her bearing, her worthiness to carry the title she now bore. And then, just as the gathering had settled into a rhythm of polite conversation, a late arrival was announced. Lady Philippa Ridley, Mr. Benedict Hawthorne intoned from the doorway, his voice carrying that particular neutrality that excellent servants employed when they personally disapproved of a guest but were too professional to show it. Leticia's blood went cold. She had not known her sister would be here, had not imagined that Philippa would have the audacity to appear at Winterbourne Manor after what she had done. But here she stood, sweeping into the drawing-room with the confidence of someone who believed the world existed for her entertainment, her traveling cloak still dusted with snow and her smile sharp as winter itself. "My dear sister," Philippa announced, moving through the assembled guests with practiced grace. "How extraordinary to find you established as mistress of such an estate. One would hardly have imagined it, given your usual circumstances." There was laughter in her voice, the laughter of someone who believed a joke was about to be shared, who expected the room to join her in finding amusement in the situation. Several of the guests shifted uncomfortably. Alistair's hand found the small of Leticia's back, a gesture so subtle that only she would notice it, but the pressure of his palm against her spine was steady and unmistakably protective. "Lady Philippa," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that silenced the nearby conversations. "What an unexpected pleasure." "On the contrary," Philippa replied, moving closer with the confidence of a woman who had no idea she was walking into danger. "It was most illuminating. I was just telling Lord Ashcombe earlier how delighted I was that our little arrangement had worked out so well." She turned then to address the room more broadly, and Leticia felt her stomach drop as she understood what was about to happen. "Your Grace," Philippa continued, her voice carrying that particular tone of false intimacy, "I must confess something that I have been simply dying to tell you. The circumstances of your marriage are perhaps more amusing than you have been led to understand." The drawing-room had gone very quiet. "I was responsible for the arrangement," Philippa said, clearly relishing the attention. "It came to me as something of a jest, you understand. Our dear Leticia, invisible as she has always been, seemed the perfect complement to a man of your retiring nature. A union born of convenience and mutual indifference. Lord Ashcombe and I thought it rather brilliant, actually. How delightfully modern of us all." There was no malice in her tone, which somehow made it worse. Only the thoughtless cruelty of a woman who believed that speaking of the mechanisms of mockery was somehow socially sophisticated. The Duke's expression did not change, but Leticia felt something crystallize in the air around them, a moment of recognition and judgment. "I see," Alistair said quietly, and those two words carried more weight than any amount of anger might have done. "You are the architect of this arrangement, then?" "Indeed I am," Philippa replied, laughing. "Rather proud of it, actually. Though I confess, I expected you to be far more disappointed by the prize. Yet here you are, seemingly content with our little wallflower." There was a moment then, a single suspended moment, in which the entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. The Duke turned to look at Leticia, and in his gaze was something that had not been there before. Not indifference. Not mere courtesy. But something that burned with an intensity that made the air between them shimmer. "You are laboring," he said, his voice still quiet but now carrying a force that made even those at the far end of the room strain to hear, under a fundamental misunderstanding of considerable magnitude. He stepped closer to Leticia, and she felt her heart begin to beat in a way that made coherent thought nearly impossible. His hand moved from her back to her shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "My wife," Alistair continued, and the way he said "my wife" carried a weight of ownership and pride that made several guests gasp audibly, "was not the jest. She was the test." He paused, and in that pause Leticia saw her sister's expression begin to shift from confidence to confusion. "A test," the Duke repeated, "that she has passed with grace and dignity that puts to shame every person in this household, myself most certainly included. You believed you were offering me a woman of no consequence, someone invisible and easily dismissed. What you actually provided was the only person in my acquaintance who has treated me with unguarded honesty, who has seen past the walls I built and chosen to remain present anyway, who has demonstrated that true worth has nothing whatever to do with loudness or display but everything to do with character." The room had gone absolutely silent. Alistair extended his hand to Leticia, and when she placed her trembling fingers in his palm, he raised them to his lips and pressed a kiss against her gloved knuckles that was neither purely formal nor entirely intimate but something suspended perfectly between the two. "Would you walk with me?" he asked, and though it was phrased as a question, it was really a statement. A claim. A choosing that was being made visible to everyone present. Leticia managed to nod, and together they withdrew from the drawing room, leaving behind a stunned silence and Philippa's face frozen in an expression that was equal parts shock and dawning humiliation. As they moved through the corridors toward his study, Leticia was aware that they were being followed at a discreet distance by curious eyes, that the story of what had just occurred would be repeated and embellished for months to come. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that Alistair's hand held hers with a firmness that suggested he had no intention of letting go, and that when they reached the study and he closed the door behind them, shutting out the world and all its cruel entertainment, his expression finally cracked into something raw and real. The crystal prism sat where it always did, catching the light of the fire and scattering it into component colors across the desk, across the walls, across both their faces as they stood there in the sudden quiet. Inside the study, with the door closed against the world and its judgments, Alistair released Leticia's hand and moved to stand before the fire. For a long moment he said nothing, and Leticia could see the way his shoulders rose and fell with measured breathing, as though he were trying to master some emotion too powerful to be contained easily. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice rough in a way she had never heard before. "A profound apology that I do not know how to properly articulate." "You have treated me with courtesy," Leticia replied. "I have no complaint." He turned then, and the look on his face stopped whatever else she might have said. There was anguish there, and anger, but not directed at her. Rather at himself, at the situation, at the cruelty that had brought them together and the walls he had maintained. "Courtesy is not enough," he said. "It has never been enough. I have been a poor husband, Leticia. I have treated you as a transaction when you deserve to be treated as someone of considerable worth, someone whose presence has made this house bearable in ways I did not think possible." He moved closer, close enough now that she could see the way his hands trembled slightly. "Your eyes," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "awoke something in me that I believed was dead. A capacity for hope, for trust, for the possibility of love that is not performance or transaction but something real and true. I do not know if you feel anything remotely similar, but I needed you to know what has happened to me in the quiet of these weeks. That you have become essential to me, that the thought of you being hurt makes me understand what Helena meant about the difference between living and merely existing." Leticia felt tears blur her vision. She had come to Winterbourne Manor believing herself to be a jest, and here was this man telling her that she had become essential to his existence. "I came here," she said, her voice unsteady but determined to match his honesty, "believing myself to be exactly what my sister intended. A convenient solution to a problem. And in coming here I found something I did not expect." She reached up to touch his face, her fingertips gentle against his cheek, and she felt him lean into her touch as though it were water after years in the desert. "I found a man who tends growing things in the middle of winter," she continued. "Who preserves his mother's memory through attention to her garden. Who holds himself with such rigid control not because he feels nothing but because he feels too much. I have seen your capacity for kindness, Alistair. And I have come to understand that being chosen by you is not a humiliation. It is a gift." He kissed her then, and it was not the perfunctory gesture their wedding had required. It was an affirmation, a declaration that two people had found something that burned with genuine warmth. His hands came up to frame her face, and she felt the tremor in them, felt the barely restrained emotion he was allowing her to witness. When they finally drew apart, both breathing unsteadily, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered, "I do not deserve you, but I find I am selfish enough to want you anyway." "Then we are matched in our selfishness," Leticia replied, "because I have no intention of leaving." When they returned to the drawing room much later, the quality of the gathering had shifted entirely. Philippa had withdrawn to her chambers, her confidence shattered. Lord Ashcombe avoided meeting anyone's eyes. And the remaining guests, witnessing the change in how the Duke and Duchess moved through the room together, how his hand never left the small of her back, began to realize that something significant had occurred. That evening, at the Christmas supper, Alistair rose from his place at the head of the table, and with clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, offered a toast. "To my wife," he said, and his voice carried tenderness that filled the dining room. "To a woman who was chosen for reasons of convenience and indifference, who was offered to me as entertainment, and who chose in return to offer kindness, honesty, and grace that has redeemed not only her circumstances but mine as well. To Leticia, the light that has made this house and this heart bearable once more." He took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss against her fingers in a gesture that was both formal and deeply intimate. "Welcome to Winterbourne Manor," he continued, not as the Duchess by arrangement, but as the woman who has made it a home. The room erupted in applause, genuine this time, understanding they had witnessed not just a marriage being validated but a transformation being declared. 5 years later. The Winter Conservatory at Winterbourne Manor had expanded considerably. New glass panels extended it nearly twice its original size. On a winter morning not unlike the one on which Leticia had first discovered the sanctuary, Alistair stood among the blooms with a child balanced on his shoulders. Their daughter Isolde, not yet 3, reached toward a hanging orchid with joyful abandon. Her dark hair escaped from mourning plaits, and her laugh filled the warm space with sound that had been absent from Winterbourne Manor for far too long. "Gently, my love," Alistair instructed, his voice soft with indulgence. "Remember, we speak to what we love with gentleness." Leticia watched from the doorway, cradling their newborn son Lucien against her shoulder. The baby slept peacefully, unaware of the love surrounding him. "She has your eyes," Alistair said, turning to look at his wife with an expression that still held, after 5 years, the quality of wonder. "And your determination to examine every growing thing. I fear we shall be plagued with botanical questions for years." "There are worse fates," Leticia replied, moving closer through the forest of green they had cultivated together. I have been meaning to discuss something with you, he said, as their daughter began singing an off-key song about snow. Hartley House, my property in Hampshire, has been empty for years. I have been thinking it would be suitable for an academy. Leticia looked at him directly. For young women of modest means, he continued. Governesses, companions, women such as you were. Capable and intelligent but with limited opportunities. I was thinking we might establish something that would give them the education and sense of dignity that your life at Blackthorn Hall failed to provide. Leticia felt tears prick her eyes. You are thinking of my sister, she said quietly, and of others like her. Of women who are taught to be invisible and who deserve to be seen. I am thinking, Alistair replied, of what it means that you taught me to see. That you showed me the value of things society marks as insignificant. And I am thinking that we have a responsibility to extend that vision to others. Then we shall do it, she said. We shall create the academy and teach young women that invisibility is not permanent, that worth is inherent rather than conferred. The crystal prism now sat on a shelf in the conservatory where Isolde could reach it and watch it transform light into rainbows. The Duke's mother had been wise, Alistair thought. Light was indeed the same everywhere, but one must choose the prism through which to see it. If you've stayed until this moment, dear friends, I need to know you're there. Drop where you're watching from in the comments right now, don't just watch and leave. Because here's what Leticia and Alistair discovered, and what I need you to understand. We are all walking around carrying wounds, building walls, trying to protect ourselves from being hurt again. And sometimes, if we are very fortunate, someone comes along who sees us anyway. Who looks past the walls and wounds to the person beneath. Perhaps you have felt what Leticia felt in those early days. That moment of realizing you were offered to the world for reasons that had nothing to do with your true value, that you were being used rather than cherished, overlooked rather than seen. But listen to me, invisibility is not permanence. The world's assessment of your worth is not your true measure. Somewhere in this vast, complicated world exists someone capable of seeing you as you truly are. Not as a convenience. Not as a jest. But as a complete and worthy human being deserving of love and respect. Alistair did not choose Leticia initially. The choice was made for him by people who meant it as entertainment. But in time he learned to see her, truly see her, and in learning to see her he discovered that he had been seen in return. This is the gift of grace. Not that we are chosen despite being overlooked, but that we are chosen precisely because someone brave enough to truly look has seen who we actually are. If you have felt overlooked, type I see you in the comments right now. If you have known the pain of being made into entertainment for others, drop a love below. Your worth is not determined by those who fail to recognize it. You deserve to be seen. You deserve to be valued. And if this story brought you comfort tonight, if Leticia's journey gave you hope for your own, do something for me, share where you're watching from and whether this story touched something in your experience. Have you known the pain of invisibility? Have you experienced the grace of being truly seen? Your stories matter. Your words matter. Every time you share your truth in the comments, you make it easier for someone else to recognize their own. The 127 people who comment become part of something bigger, a community that sees each other. We invite you to return next week when we bring you another tale of quiet redemption, of grace discovered in unexpected places. Until then, may you know in your bones that you are worthy of being chosen. Not as a jest, not as a convenience, but as the remarkable, infinitely valuable person that you have always been. Thank you for spending this evening with us. Thank you for allowing Leticia and Alistair to speak to whatever wounds you carry. Thank you for being here, for being you, for continuing to hope even when hope seems like torture. Now drop that comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Don't just scroll away, say something. Anything. Let me know you're there. You are seen. You are valued. And somewhere, perhaps closer than you think, someone is looking for exactly the light you carry.